Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome. It is a great honor to open talk number 6 of this series that has been going on since March, which is called Reading in Interfaces, Theories, Methods, and Applications. And we are also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the postgraduate program in English, which was founded in 1971. So this virtual event is organized by Nel from UFSC, Núcleo de Estudos em Leitura, under my coordination, and Gempi, from PUC, Rio Grande do Sul, Grupo de Estudos em Neurolinguística e Psicolinguística, coordinated by my colleague Lilliama Project, with the support of Programa de Pós-Graduação em Inglês, of course, okay? So I would like to thank Professor Brandon Weeks for being here today, for having accepted our invitation so promptly, and for his generosity in sharing his expertise with us, okay? And I would also like to thank my colleague Ricardo De Souza for having accepted to mediate this talk, okay? And thank you for the audience, all the people who are here in Zoom and also on YouTube, okay? So thank you very much. And now I'm gonna give the floor to my colleague Lilliama Project, who's going to present, introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Leda. Thank you everybody for being here, for attending this meeting, the 6th in our chain of meetings in this cycle of events, with the topic of reading. And today we are very, very honored to have Professor Brandon Weeks. I'm gonna read a brief biodata, the biodata. So Professor Brandon Weeks is Foundation Chair in Communication Science at the University of Hong Kong and Director of the Laboratory for Communication Science, also at that university, and principal investigator of the State Key Laboratory for Brain and Cognitive Science, funded by the Ministry of Science and Technology of the People's Republic of China. Professor Weeks is an international recognized expert in the domain of language and cognitive processing, in speakers who have communication disorders, as well as in the application of cognitive neuroscience methods to the diagnosis and treatment of language impairment. He won a prestigious fellowship in the Humanities and Social Science awarded by the Research Grants Council in 2020 and has received several prizes for his teaching and research. Professor Weeks is a member of the editorial boards of Aphasiology, Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, Languages and Psychology, reflecting his interests in communication disorders and experimental psychology in different languages. He has also served on expert panels for the Australian Research Council, British Academy, the Economic and Social Research Council, Multilingual at the University of Oslo, Research Grants Council Hong Kong, Royal Society UK, Medical Research Council, and the National Science Foundation in the United States. He's a professor fellow at the University of Melbourne and currently a visitor in experimental psychology at the University of Cambridge and was ambassador for UNESCO in 2019. So Professor Weeks, thank you so much. As Leda already said, it was very kind of you for accepting our invitation. We know how busy you are, and it's really a great honor to having you here and sharing a bit of your expertise with us. Thank you very much. And then the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very delighted to be with you today. It's the middle of summer in London. Unfortunately, we have a much lower temperature than you in Brazil. I had a wonderful trip to Brazil, most recently in 2019, and traveled all over the country. And I'm looking forward to when we return to normal so that I can come back to see you all again. I'm wanting to today talk a little bit about some aspects of writing systems in a linguistic, more sociolinguistic context. But in addition to that, I want to introduce to you a type of concept that I've been thinking about for the past 2 years, which reflects my experience at the University of Hong Kong. That is to say, teaching in a second language, in English to be precise. At the University of Hong Kong, the official language of instruction is English. And in fact, there are many rules that prohibit the use of other languages in the classroom at that university. I'm also going to explore what it means to teach in that context in a second language, and a little bit of my own experience at the university, both in terms of language contact and also, if we have some time, conflict. As you know, there's been a lot of changes at the level of socio-political culture in Hong Kong, and I have a great deal of history in that particular domain. I'm going to refrain from discussing that today, but if we have time, please ask me questions, and I have some slides to illustrate my lived experience in Hong Kong in terms of language contact. I'm also formally retiring from the university next week, and so after that point, I can be much more expansive on my own experience there. I'd also like to acknowledge my support from the University of Cambridge currently and UNESCO, where I'm still active in the Information for All program, which is based in Moscow. And recently we had a conference that focused on how the use of digital literacy is changing the educational landscape. And I will discuss those issues today as well. So a little bit of my background I think is helpful here. A very kind introduction from Lillian that gave you a bit of a context for my scientific background. I'm also a trained clinical neuropsychologist. And so a lot of my work is shaped by my impressions of language use in terms of the neuropathology that follows from stroke, dementia, head injury, and so on. And because I've worked for my whole career outside of the, oops, that didn't supposed to happen, outside of the Anglosphere, I want to focus a little bit on how we are able to think about the use of language in a broader context. And to do that, I was very happy to be a member of the UNESCO Year of the Indigenous Language, and that's the point at which I came to Brazil, in fact. And we celebrated Indigenous languages in multiple locations around the world. And this gave me a sense of the importance of linguistic diversity that I wasn't fully appreciating, I think, before I had that experience at UNESCO. So thanks to UNESCO for including me. Now, my background, as I mentioned, includes the study of language pathology, but also dyslexia and the way in which literacy is contextualized within the psychological framework of poor reading or impaired reading. Dyslexia refers to problems learning to read and is focused on problems with the sounds of letters in English and other alphabetic languages. Reading comprehension difficulties are another aspect of my work, including the ability to infer meaning from text. And I'll touch a bit on that as we move through the talk. Poor comprehenders are characterized by an inability to be able to answer questions that are not literal about the context of a text that they're asked to digest. And of course, as I work beyond the Anglosphere, I've done a lot of work on these topics in Chinese particularly, but in a number of other languages, named languages, as I shall explain shortly. And I would also point out that I'm an experimental psychologist, which is essentially focused on cognition, the cognitive world. And my experience in Hong Kong has helped me to understand literacy in learning, particularly in teaching written words that are not familiar to undergraduate students in the field of medicine, neurology, speech pathology, and so forth, and experimental psychology. And I have published some work on this because I think it's important to point out that there are cognitive mechanisms that are shared across different languages. So language is important, certainly. But I think if we burrow down more deeply on how we use language in an educational context, then it's important to try to unpack how cognitive processes, particularly memory, will impact upon learning and also the ability to use a second language in the classroom. Wanted to also just point out that my talk is very much based on my own learning. So I'm still trying to evolve as a scholar. I'm 60 years of age next week, but I'm still interested in trying to build upon what I know and explore new avenues. And that's partly what I want to do today with you. So I welcome any feedback you have as experts in your own field. And I'd be very grateful to receive critical feedback at the end of the talk. Now, a key point to make, I think, at the beginning is to say that my career began early looking at cross-scriptal effects at a neural level. This was in the 90s. And at that time, brain imaging was not at all well developed. In fact, we were among the first to do any work on comparing the recognition of words, written words in the brain across more than one culture or language. So examples here include work done in Singapore, where we identified that people who were trained to read English words and Chinese characters, when in the scanner and presented with these symbols to decode using a number of different paradigms, we essentially showed there were no differences at the neural level between Chinese characters and English words. These were Singaporean students who were very fluent, also very highly selected, as Singapore is a very competitive academic environment. We did so using a number of images that were also in Chinese, able to be shown as pictures. Now, I don't want to describe the Chinese writing system in too much depth today, although I will come back to it. The essential point here is that we can present a picture of a horse, which looks something like the character for horse in Chinese. And we also tested whether the brain regions that were processing pictures were the same as those that were processing Chinese characters. The answer is they're not. There are distinct regions in the right and left hemisphere for pictures, right, and characters, left, whereas English words and Chinese characters were processed in pretty much the same areas in the left hemisphere. Now, others that I've worked with in Hong Kong and mainland China argue that there are differences between Chinese character processing and English word processing. But overall, my experience of, well, over 20 years of research in this field shows that there are very few differences in the neural structures or processes processing different languages, certainly insofar as written language is concerned. And we've done several studies across different cultures. I mentioned some of them here. And the answer seems to be the same, that the language independent account of neural processing is more sustainable than the language dependent account. So please keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, a very recent study we did in Hong Kong was sort of an example of this, but here I want to now describe the work on translation that will be the substance of my talk today. So this very interesting study showed that when we get 3 different groups of participants in Hong Kong, students who come from, first of all, the Netherlands, second of all, India, and third of all, local students in Hong Kong who speak Cantonese and read and write using Chinese characters, but also use English in a fully bilingual context. The students from the Netherlands and the students from India were also fully bilingual, but they used two different writing systems. In the Netherlands, Dutch is written in an alphabet. In India, the languages are written in an Akshara script, which is something different again, a type of alpha syllabary. And of course, in Chinese, the writing system is what we call logographic. In the case of comparing translation, both forward and backwards in these three groups of students, we were able to show that when moving from the first language to the second language and vice versa, there were differences across the three groups that were of interest. The first difference is that we expected there to be far more activity in the brain moving between Chinese characters and English words. So a Chinese character is presented to a Hong Kong student, and they must translate that into an English word, and vice versa. Whereas the same would be true for a Dutch-English bilingual, but of course the two words are presented in an alphabet. Surprisingly, we found that the greatest amount of interference or activity in the brain came from the Dutch-English group, where two alphabetic writing systems were used. Well, more precisely, one alphabet is used in two different languages. And the Indian students fell somewhere in between. So the interesting point here is that in the case of the Dutch-English group, we found specific conflict effects in the brain at a level of the brain called the anterior cingulate, which is shown here in the slide, the red area on the top left-hand panel. The Chinese English and Hindi English from India looked much more similar. The outliers were the Dutch English group. And the conclusion we came to is that when there are two alphabetically written words in two different languages, that generates far more conflict and interference than it does for different writing systems. I'm wanting to focus on this issue because in the context of my talk, I want to deconstruct the importance of brain imaging research. My whole career is based on that data, but I want to move away from that in the talk today and share with you some thoughts from my own experience teaching in Hong Kong, but also working at UNESCO and doing a number of other aspects of studies of literacy in educational contexts beyond Hong Kong, but more specifically in the global South. So some examples of studies we've done in Hong Kong with colleagues leading the way on these studies are literature reviews on the impact of various constraints that exist in the global South, such as income, nutrition, opportunities, diversity and exclusion, and also more specifically on those effects for literacy in the global South. And although I won't focus on the outcomes of these studies, I will just say that this puts into context why the work we do in neuroscience has to be more relevant and have greater impact than it does presently. And that's the journey I'm currently on. A very good example of this from my work at UNESCO and subsequently work that I became aware of in West Africa for literacy concerns the Lilliama Project, which is a really fascinating project that I highly recommend those interested in literacy take a look at. The substance of the Lilliama Project, which is funded by the government of Finland, but in fact the work is done in Senegal, is to allow community dwelling groups who are not literate to acquire literacy in their native or indigenous language. And all of this happens on the ground in communities where often the people in the community are speaking several different languages. So in this example, the village has 3 different languages spoken, but no formalized writing system is used to speak in those languages. So the solution that the research team came up with, sorry about that, I don't know what's wrong with my slides, is to enable people to use an alphabetic writing system. The reason an alphabetic writing system was chosen is because French is taught in schools, and so there is some familiarity with the alphabet in Senegal. But the key point is that it was possible to use the alphabet to write all of these different languages as each of the individuals wished to do. So there was no barrier put or rule or code imposed upon how to write in the native language. And this particular project, which, as you see, is language independent literacy for inclusive education in multilingual areas, has had a major impact on UNESCO in terms of the way in which we can include more participants who speak an indigenous minority language in the acquisition of literacy. So I'm grateful to have had that opportunity. If we move to other parts of the world where I've worked, I would like to make some points about how literacy is a fluid construct in the way in which the same language can be rendered in different writing systems to define the culture within which a person is living. So here is a colleague in Agra in India, that's where the Taj Mahal is located, a linguist who spent 10 years transliterating the Quran into the native Devanagari script of Hindi speakers. Now, a couple of points to note here are that the blue symbols are the Devanagari Akshara. The blue symbols are the Arabic Quran symbols. The black are the Devanagari characters we call Akshara. And the street upon which my colleague lives has both Urdu and Hindi speakers. That's the nature of Agra and many cities in India. The two writing systems can be found on the same street, and yet the two languages, so-called languages, are perfectly interchangeable. So she can speak to her Urdu neighbor in the same language, but the writing system is completely different. The point I wish to make here is that writing systems define the identity and cultural normative structure of individuals, even within the very same community. And that matters when we think about literacy across writing systems. I want to turn to Brazil because I was able to visit Brazil. I learned many things. I just want to pick up on a couple of points that really stuck with me. Of course, you have many indigenous languages. The standard writing system, like in Senegal, is alphabetic, but there are mismatches between indigenous language and writing systems in Brazil. And I was very well informed by a number of linguists in Bahia and other places, where I discovered that there is a problem for indigenous cultures acquiring literacy because of the rigid codification of alphabetic writing in Brazil. And I just also wanted to point out, because I'm coming on now to the sociolinguistics of literacy, that I was fascinated by the stories of the Muslim slaves who rebelled against the slave owners by introducing secret African writing. And here's an example of the way in which African slaves in Brazil would communicate with each other in Bahia in the 19th century. And that led to a number of changes in the emancipation, ultimately, of slaves in Brazil. African writing systems may well have been in contact with indigenous Brazilians as far back as the 14th century. We don't have evidence of that, but there's some speculation. Now, I want to move on now to my epiphany, which is to say I've become far more interested in the concept of translanguaging, partly because of my experience in China, specifically in Hong Kong, but also because of its relevance to understanding the acquisition of literacy by indigenous cultures, and also the power within which we can bestow upon people through using different literacies in multiliteracies in a productive way. So the most important person associated with translanguaging is Ofelia Garcia from CUNY, who's now retired. but also my colleague Angel Lin, who's now in Canada, but was my close colleague at the Faculty of Education for 10 years. And of course, Li Wei, who I've known for 30 years, meeting him first in Beijing, in fact, before he migrated to London and became the director of UCL, which is the latest news in the past couple of months. These books that they published were familiar to me, but because of my living in Hong Kong in a Faculty of Education, I became much more immersed in issues surrounding English and Englishes as dominant in a colonial context, and what that meant for the acquisition of literacy for my own students. And I could tell stories, I could probably construct a whole course on the way in which the use of English in Hong Kong has changed in the past couple of years. Translanguaging, for those unfamiliar with the concept, is really defined here in the bottom left-hand panel. What I would say about translanguaging specifically today is that it is focused on spoken language comprehension and spoken language production. I'm certainly no expert on translanguaging, apart from, of course, experiencing it every day in Hong Kong. But I would say that what's missing from the literature in translanguaging is the idea of moving between different writing systems, which I will call transliterating. And that's what I want to talk about today. Translanguaging is relevant to education. It mobilizes different language processes across the spoken domains within a second language classroom. It's designed to improve the way students learn a second language by allowing a repertoire of different linguistic features to be resourced in order to acquire more than one language. And the way it's done, I won't dwell on today, but there are many methods and strategies that are now employed in classrooms to do that. And Angel, for example, would give a very good talk on how that's normal in Hong Kong. And I certainly observed that myself. But when we think about language as a structure, and I think now I wish to call upon your own expertise and talk about the way translanguaging experts refer to linguistic structure as somehow a barrier to the acquisition of many languages. I will refer to the traditions of linguistics, Saussure, and also those like Chomsky who focus on the typology of language, the way in which language is necessarily a study of spoken domain, and specifically how artificial representations or abstract representations of language are shared universally across different cultures around the history of language. What I do want to say, though, is that what all of the linguists who I know share is a sort of a kind of cursory glance at literacy. And I think that's a mistake, and that's what I would like to rectify in the future. I would also point out that the general consensus amongst my colleagues who focus on translanguaging is the notion of heteroglossia. So terms like diglossia, code switching, those are seen as irrelevant now. And the reason those are irrelevant is because on the one hand, translanguaging embraces the diversity of spoken languages in the classroom and beyond, but also the idea that the codification of language and the labeling and naming of different languages at a very fundamental level is irrelevant to the process of acquiring a second language. And that's quite a strong statement, but it really is a kind of disruption of traditional linguistics that I'm absolutely drawn to and very fascinated by. So to define transliterating specifically, I want to separate it from other concepts that are very similar but different, and just specifically give you a very punchy set of words that I've used to define what I mean. That is written here, the practice emphasis on communicating across different writing systems in the physical, that is the classroom setting, but also more specifically the virtual environment. And that's really what I've focused on at UNESCO lately with the digital Information for All program. I believe that this concept has implications for education, obviously, but also for health and for more broadly social equity and inclusion in participation politically. And I'll point out those examples if I get time at the end. The key point I wish to make, however, is that although the notion of translanguaging and transliterating appears very rosy and beneficial, there are consequences that are unforeseen, particularly in the written language space, that I wish to emphasize, because contact between writing systems can lead to conflict and misunderstanding. I would say, I guess, before moving on, is that translanguaging embraces the notion of semiotics and the idea of symbols and signs as necessary for creating meaning. So at a more fundamental level, translanguaging is not interested in linguistics formally, but in the way that we create a shared meaning across virtual or physical spaces. The virtual hasn't been studied that well by my colleagues, I have to be honest with you. So why is it different to think about translating text to translating spoken words? Well, here's a number of terms in the literature that are not transliterating. Transcreating, familiar to you, a tattoo is an example of transcreating. Translanguaging, as I've explained. Transliteration refers to literally taking one script and a human translates that into a different script. This is what translators do. And of course, that whole profession is somewhat disrupted by Google Translate. I don't need to say anything more, but I will in a minute. Transliteracy refers to a kind of much broader concept within the Information for All program. And it embraces how the digital world enables communication across various media. Transliterating, as I pointed out, describes the practice of moving between writing systems. And curiously, this can happen between spoken languages, but also within one spoken language. And let me explain why. So here I've mentioned some examples previously. This just fleshes out my notions here. Transcreating, the top right, the top left-hand corner. One particular type of transcreation I like is, of course, the use of emojis. The image here is actually a text I received this morning from a friend because it's my birthday next week. How we're going to celebrate your birthday, and you can see a number of very creative emojis used in that text. Translation and transliteration are different. They're the traditional methods of moving between writing systems in text for digital purposes, but more specifically in printed text. I'm afraid those days are gone. So people who are engaged in the process of transliteration really need to move on, and I want to illustrate how to do that as we go on. Why? Because of methods such as Google Translate. I don't need to explain those in detail. My translanguaging colleagues often refer to Google Translate without seeing the nuance, which is that transliteration is different to translanguaging. But anyway, that's a minor point, I guess. But more critically, and an example I've given here is on a smartphone. Of course, you're familiar with this. You can simply create your own text in more than one language using an alphabet, but critically, this is true beyond writing systems. You may not be familiar with more than one writing system, but as a person who uses Chinese characters, I can assure you, perhaps it's in the next notes, an upcoming slide, that it's possible to move between writing systems within a text perfectly easily. And my colleagues in Japan and also in India do it all the time. So having made that point, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of transliterating and why it's important. And I believe there are tangible and intangible aspects to the impact. I've mentioned some already in education, learning of a second language, and translation, whereby the disruption caused by rapid development of online translation. And by the way, it's not machine translation that does that. It's big data that simply uses deep learning of huge amounts of text in Chinese and the association between that text and English words, which is initially done by a human, but once online, a deep learning algorithm doesn't require a human. It can simply come up with an algorithm that will translate perfectly Chinese characters into English words verbatim. And this seems to be just getting better and better. Of course, it will ultimately become perfect with more and more data online. But there are intangible consequences as well, and I've referred to them briefly. In the community, as I've pointed out, some geopolitical consequences, which I will come to, and psychological. What does it mean to use more than one writing system from a psychological point of view is one question. Another deeper question, though, is what are the psychological mechanisms? And hand up, I am a psychologist, so I can't help but be interested in the cognitive mechanisms that would be impacted by the process of transliterating. So I mentioned Japan and India, two places I've spent a lot of time in the past. And I'm drawn to these locations for a lot of reasons, mostly the food, but also the writing systems. And I know in Brazil, you have a number of Japanese speakers and people who actually are still literate in kanji and kana and hiragana. And I just wanted to make a couple of key points about why writing systems are of interest and how they differ across and between languages. So kanji and the hiragana and katakana that are displayed here are symbols that represent sounds, but they can be depicted with different symbols. This is the key point, within one language. So it's not moving across spoken languages as translanguaging experts would be interested in. It's moving between writing systems within one language. And I'm assured by my extremely expert Japanese colleagues that this happens all the time in schools. So children are encouraged in school to move between written symbols across different languages, across different writing systems within the Japanese language context, so that it's a fluid practice that's codified and perfectly acceptable within Japanese schools. Let's move to India. By contrast, there are multiple spoken languages in India. Some of them are mutually intelligible, others are not. What's common across these spoken languages is a writing system called the Akshara. The linguistics of that is another lecture, but essentially the Devanagari characters that are written are imposed upon different spoken languages, somewhat imperfectly in many cases, but nevertheless, it's possible to transliterate. So if I'm in the lab in Delhi, I can see students who are texting each other using different Devanagari characters to symbolize Hindi words or other spoken words. It's just a perfectly fluid and normal practice to text across writing systems in India. And as I mentioned earlier, to do that between Urdu and Devanagari is again completely fluid, normal, acceptable practice. So these are phenomena that I didn't invent. They just happen spontaneously, and they're a consequence of contact between writing systems, both within and between languages. Now, going back to Senegal, this is exactly what happens in Senegal, where individuals who are not literate are encouraged to use what they know about alphabet. And if they don't know the alphabet, they're taught the sounds of letters in the alphabet, often in French, but nevertheless, those sounds can then be adapted to the indigenous language. And interestingly, there are many examples of people texting each other with smartphones using alphabets to communicate across spoken languages that are used within one village. The writing systems that occur across the world are diverse. I've spoken about this before in Brazil. It happens to be more of a hobby of mine, but there are many of them, as you can see. So the potential for contact across writing systems is vast, particularly in a place like India, as I've mentioned, but potentially also in other parts of the world that are understudied, in my opinion. So transliteration, just to focus on this again, as I mentioned in the lab in Delhi, where I've worked for many years, we can see examples of moving between alphabet and Devanagari script, Urdu, etc. In Israel, where I also work, you can see multiple examples of using alphabets to express words in Arabic, but also Hebrew. These days, these spoken translations are easy to communicate with using these devices, one of which I used in Japan perfectly easily to communicate with people who could direct me how to take the right metro line, speaking in English, comes out in Japanese. It's all racing far ahead of us. And the same is true in the written domain. A key point to go with as I move on is the notion of semiotics, which is to say that a lot of what we're doing in these practices is simply to express shared meaning, to find ways of sharing meaning. And of course, signs, the classic study of semiotics, are one way to do that. I come here to a Portuguese philosopher, the Epistemology of Meaning, which is to look beyond the signs. So signs are not sufficient. We need to look beneath. And I'll come back to that in question time. The notion of multi-script transliteration is not new. So I'm just around the corner from the British Museum, where we have the Rosetta Stone. These are some examples from ancient times. Multiple writing systems have always been used together and expressed together in tablet form, in texts, and now on the internet. So if I move to the right-hand panel, I mentioned earlier, the way that transliterating occurs across text in Hong Kong and other Chinese-speaking environments, where it's possible to text a friend in English and then receive a reply in Chinese, which is then transcribed instantly. So the flexibility is endless and will only get better. I wanted to make a point, and I already have really, but just to clearly state that machine translation, which was, of course, the occupation of linguists for 30 years, up until the development of deep learning algorithms, was imperfect. So here's an example of the word Smith transliterated for machine learning software into syllables and subsyllables that could be recognized as Chinese syllables in the Chinese language. So we've got S coded as sh, which is a recognizable syllable in Chinese, and th, which is a hard one for Chinese, into th, which is also a recognizable Chinese character. But the result is shmith, it's not Smith. So using characters alone to transliterate using machine learning was inadequate. It always was. It never worked. It applied grammatical rules that were failures. I'm sorry, I can't be any stronger. But in the context of the current big data algorithm with deep learning, these solutions are now with us to stay. Now let's move to the geopolitical sphere, because I also spoke a bit about this with UNESCO in Brazil. At the time I was speaking in Brasilia, there were two things going on. First of all, the president of China was visiting in Brasilia at that very time. And also I was in the middle of trying to explain to colleagues all around the world what was going on in Hong Kong. And that included Africa and a place called Livingston, which is a former colony of the United Kingdom in now Zambia, then Rhodesia. At the time, I was trying to explain what was happening in Hong Kong. It was all too familiar, of course, to people in Zambia, because the idea of decolonization and how that impacts upon language use was an issue that I was speaking about often in Africa. Interesting though, I was asked to speak about how Chinese would be more important than English in Zambia in the future. And I think that resonates with you, because I had the same kinds of conversations in Brazil. Lillian will confirm that. But the point I wish to make is simultaneously, I was trying to explain that on the ground in Hong Kong, a decolonization was also taking place, but a regime change was also occurring at the same time. And some of the phenomena that were curious to linguists then, and I still find curious, were the use of instant messaging, such as Telegram and Signal, to communicate during the protests in Hong Kong using alphabetic symbols to express Cantonese words. This never, ever happened in Hong Kong, ever. You never saw that. There was a strict codification of Chinese words written with Chinese characters, never with alphabetic symbols. It was almost well, crime is actually a pertinent word now, because these activities are now criminal. But the method of getting around the problems with the protests at the time was to communicate using a secret code, which was alphabets at that time. These images I'm showing you on the right-hand side are now illegal, and therefore I've broken the law in Hong Kong. Apologies. And that's one reason why I cannot go back. What does this mean? Well, homographs in English are very common. And again, this is something that will be familiar to you because you've learned English, I know, and you can see some words here that may be familiar to you, those difficult words. We call homographs. I'll explain more what they are shortly. But in the case of English homographs, we see that oftentimes we can decode those using different stress. Interestingly, in English, this often signals a noun or a verb. There are other ways of doing it, using rhymes and changing the phonology of the schwa in the word. But homographs are not unusual across different languages. They're less common in some languages than others. But in alphabets, we get variability in how consistent a particular spelling will be in terms of its pronunciation. This means that the same spelling can have multiple meanings, which of course is relevant to learning English, but is critical when we think about the verbatim transliteration of an English word into another language, specifically Chinese. I found that to my peril. What is the difference between a homograph and a homophone? Well, this is a kind of complicated slide, but I don't want to be patronizing, but I've spelled this out in some detail so that you can see, and Lillian's very free to share these slides at a later point, she has them all, how it is that the same spelling and the same pronunciation are characterized using psycholinguistic terms that are probably not familiar to many of you, but I think you can get the drift in the sense of there being different levels, psycholinguistic levels of how spellings and meanings coalesce with sounds in order to create difficulties in learning how to acquire English specifically. This won't be unfamiliar to you, having all learned English as a second language, but the key point I wish to make is it's not unique to English. It's also true in other languages, and let me return to Japanese. So the kanji character, which incidentally is borrowed from Chinese characters historically, can also be read in multiple ways, just like an English homonym. So you can have the same character read as soda, which means to raise up, or contrast kyou. You can, and I don't know Japanese, so forgive my poor Japanese. These are called kun and on readings of the same symbol. So effectively just like dessert. In the case of Chinese, we also see it's true, a complicated example here, but we can have the same character pronounced in slightly different ways. You notice the variability comes on at the onset of the syllable. That's an interesting linguistic question in itself. The key point here is that across and within writing systems, we can see some potential for misunderstanding. So if we return back to Brazil and Africa, I think there are similarities in terms of indigenous language use and how it is used in education where alphabets, that's the color green here, the Latin alphabet, is dominant. And so I'd like to unpack that a little bit in question time if we can. But I want to move beyond that to talk a little bit about how we can disrupt the notion of literacy in the context of education. And I want to speak now from the perspective of UNESCO, where I, as I have often said, I'm working still on Information for All program. We recently constructed a declaration for the UN on disrupting digital literacy, but I think it works for other practices as well. The key notion is that literacy is not defined as a functional printed or written word. In the context of the Information for All program, it's really more in terms of the idea of transliteracy, where multimedia can be used to express concepts. For linguists, this is not a new idea, but for people interested in embracing diversity and in protecting indigenous languages and looking specifically at the virtual space, this is something important. The key idea is that social construction of meaning depends more and more on digital literacy. More and more people are excluded from digital literacy. And for that reason, the UN program is trying very hard, the UNESCO program is trying very hard to think about these issues in the digital space. So apologies if that's of no interest, but it is quite topical. In addition to that, this notion of widening participation so that differences in writing systems can be embraced rather than codified and excluded or banned. And don't let me give you the wrong impression about Japan. Historically, the Japanese writing systems were very highly codified, so that the whole development of the kana writing system was due to women not being allowed to be literate. And so they invented their own writing system. And so the history of literacy is replete with examples of that type. But the general idea moving forward is that democratizing communication within the digital space requires much more understanding of the contact between writing systems online. And for that, I refer back to this notion of the way that the symbols that we use are an intangible cultural aspect of life in the future, and specifically in educational contexts. I think there's also a possibility that writing online using text and transliterating is possibly developing a metalinguistic awareness, which I think is valuable in itself. So here's my summary, and I hope that it's been clear. I hope I haven't gone over time either. Essentially, transliterating is derived from translanguaging, but is specific to text or code. It's expressing meaning in multiple scripts, but that could be within a language, such as Japanese. It's concerned with social construction of meaning beyond all other issues. And that key principle is shared by my colleagues who work on translanguaging, but also by my colleagues at UNESCO who work on digital literacy. And the key problem here for scholars, I think, and I must say I'm disinterested now, I'm sorry to tell you, Lillian, much more disinterested in brain than I ever was, because I think these issues are far more critical for scholarly work in the future. I think codified writing systems in and of themselves will always exist, but the extent to which we can flexibly move between them is simply brought about by digital transformation. Quickly speaking, I guess there will be some questions about the tangible impacts here, and I'm no expert, I'm not a trained teacher. I would refer you to some of the YouTube clips by Ofelia Garcia, who gives very specific concrete examples of translanguaging in the classroom and how that can be used for second language teaching. It's simply relevant to Brazil, I believe, because of the large number of indigenous languages that you embrace, the problems with refugees coming from other parts of South America, the notion that children could be assessed in their native language rather than Portuguese, online is an interesting one that we've actually wrestled with here in London, and I can answer questions about that. There's some very interesting ideas about that. And that's due to the translanguaging initiative, ultimately. So here, if we think about literacy as moving flexibly between codes in the virtual space, we can identify opportunities for inclusiveness beyond the dominant script. Now that's a kind of complicated way of saying, yes, we have codified writing systems. I'm not advocating brand new writing systems. That's not what's necessary. Although at a very abstract level, the code, the algorithm that deep learning produces is in and of itself a codified writing system that none of us understand. And yet it does the job of transliterating between Chinese and English almost perfectly. Now, the COVID situation has really thrown this up, and let me give you more personal experience. So because of COVID, I have not been permitted to enter Hong Kong for 2 years. And for that reason, I've done a lot of my teaching, finishing next week, online. And interesting that during this period, I've been communicating with my colleagues at King's, UCL, Imperial, and Chinese students who cannot come to London, of course we had many, or Cambridge, are now listening and doing their work in Beijing or Hong Kong in English using the virtual translations from Google or other means. So perfectly that it's now possible to submit an essay that has been written in Chinese characters, transliterated almost perfectly into English, submitted for a degree, often a degree in teaching English as a second language, and receiving a perfectly good mark. So it's not plagiarism that I'm referring to here. I think we're simply seeing the embrace of digital opportunities, and COVID has brought that about. I mean, I was an expert in flipped learning 3 or 4 years ago. I had actually turned all of my courses into virtual courses, and then bang, everyone had to do it. And now that's where we are. And of course, the UK institutions, being very savvy, have developed methods which enable students from any part of the world to join in on a program that is giving a degree from a British institution, but actually conducted in English using transliteration. Thanks COVID for that. I hope to be not too presumptuous, but I think there is some interesting dividend from the pandemic. So in conclusion, I have identified how literacy and text, I think, reflect identity, ideology, and power structures. And these geopolitical evolutions have always been true. I've given a lecture in Brazil on philology before. It's true that print has always been used as an instrument of power. And of course, it's a measure of exclusion historically as well. Contact between scripts, as I pointed out at the beginning, does leave a neural signature that reflects conflict in the brain. And a key point to take away is that, and if I have a couple of minutes, I will go on to 2 more slides. The verbatim translation of text, which I'm almost giving you a sermon to convince you of its great benefits for the future, that is not what I intend to do. I actually believe that there is a critique required on the verbatim translation of text because, of course, misunderstandings, miscomprehensions occur, and nuance is often lost in verbatim translation. And work I did in the past on the difference between verbatim understanding of text and, if you like, a gist understanding of the meaning of text causes significant difficulties in children who are learning to read and to appreciate the meaning of text. We call those children poor comprehenders, as I mentioned at the very beginning. What I would say, though, is that looking back at my career on working in dyslexia, poor reading comprehension, and speech pathology, suggests to me that the notion of dyslexia in and of itself is problematic, and so is poor comprehension, because it doesn't embrace the possibility of communicating across writing systems in an expressive way that really shares meaning in the classroom. Okay, so I'm going to pause there because I'm certain I've gone over time. Let me see, I don't have my clock. Yes, I have. So I do have more slides, but I understand that I'm probably well and truly up for time. So I'll hand back to Lillian for her advice.
Okay, thank you, Professor Weeks. Could you please, maybe you stop sharing the slides so we can see each other better. Okay, thank you so much for this brilliant talk. We learned a lot today. It was very interesting, this new idea of transliterating, because we are kind of familiar now with translanguaging, trying to get the real meaning of this word in practice at school, in our teaching practices. And now transliteracy is very interesting, and also in terms of the digital world that we live in. And I think that this, your talk is in line with the feeling that we have nowadays, that of giving more power, more presence to people with lower education, lower socioeconomic status, so that they can have more power, they can interact, they can take their floor in their communities and in their countries. So it's in line with this new trend. I think that nowadays people are more concerned and leaving their comfort zone and seeing that, okay, people need to have their space also in the society. And this is a very nice way of giving them the opportunity, yes, of not trying to break this force of a common language, a privileged language like that English mainly has nowadays, still, and giving floor to other people to have their space. It's really interesting, and especially in this digital world we live in. So thank you so much. I will now introduce our colleague Ricardo De Souza, who's going to mediate your talk and is going to bring the audience's questions. So thank you, Ricardo, for having accepted our invitation to mediate this talk. And Ricardo has a degree in psychology from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, UFMG, a master's degree in language studies, and a PhD in applied linguistics at the same university. He developed 2 postdoctoral studies, the first at the Spanish and Portuguese program in the Department of Languages, Literature and Culture at the University of Massachusetts in the United States, and the second postdoc at the Department of Linguistics and Communication Disorders at Queens College of the City University of New York, CUNY. He is a professor at the undergraduate and graduate courses of language studies at UFMG. His research areas encompass experimental psychology with a main focus in bilingualism, more specifically on the modulation of types of tasks in lexical and grammatical access, in language comprehension and production, and their interaction with individual differences of mono and bilingual speakers. He collaborates with research groups on bilingualism, cognition, language policies, and bilingual education. And besides his activities as a professor and researcher, he practices psychoanalysis as a member of the Fórum do Campo Lacaniano de Belo Horizonte. Thank you so much, Ricardo, for being here, for having accepted mediating Dr. Wick's talk.
Thank you very much, Lillian, for your very kind introduction. I also like to thank Professor Tomic for her invitation, and especially I'd like to thank Professor Weeks for this fascinating talk. I understand my role is as mediator. I can see some contributions here, but I'd like to ask if it would be too selfish for me to start with a couple of questions of my own. Would that be okay?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Okay. Professor Weeks, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I completely agree with Lillian with respect to the fact that the notion of transliterating brings innovation to, translanguaging and the comprehension of translanguaging as both an educational asset and as a way for us to overcome exclusive or exclusionary practices in education and in communication across different groups of people. So that was fascinating indeed. I very much agree with your quotation of Soucy's text in the sense that, there is this tradition in linguistics for us to view the spoken language as the real object of linguistics, which is, this kind of overlooks the cultural impact of literacy and writing systems as cognitive practices of language, right? As cognitive supports of language, which certainly interact with the way people acquire, especially second languages. And this is particularly true in the Brazilian context, the second language acquisition, which tends to be procrastinated until an age when people are literate, when students are literate. That usually tends to begin by, age 7 or 6, when students have already acquired at least the basics of writing. So, this cannot be separated, right? There is obviously some intertwining between what goes on in processing written language and using written language and the very semiotics of written language with what it means to acquire a second language. I can see that with my own child. I have she's almost 8 now. My 7-year-old child is now picking up English, and it's very clear that, she merges what it means to read in English or to read in Portuguese with what it means to be learning English as a spoken language. So, it's very tangible. It's very visible. I'd like to ask a question about the research work you showed us about cross-scriptal differences when in the study there was a comparison between speakers of Hindi, Dutch, and Chinese. And the finding was that there was more conflict with the speakers of Dutch, right, when reading in English. I was wondering if that conflict might, the kind of data that surfaced, if it could be somehow the outcome of inhibitory control of grapheme phoneme correspondences in the stronger language. And I'm making an assumption that may be wrong, but maybe Dutch is actually a stronger language with a certain kind of coding of grapheme phoneme correspondences that needed to be inhibited, even though they might be very fluent in the second language. And the reason for asking this question is because there was a study that I conducted with a former student I supervised, in which we identified grapheme phoneme interferences with high proficiency speakers of English at college level, and they seem to be treating English vocabulary. That was a very simple study with a visual word recognition paradigm, but they seem to be, it seems that the grapheme phoneme correspondences of Portuguese were somehow interfering in a way that those coding routines were being, employed. So there was kind of a, their reading of English, their identification of English was somehow parasitic to, what the grapheme phoneme correspondences in Portuguese happened to be. So we assumed there was a delay in their responses, which could be a consequence of inhibiting, those correspondences. I'm talking about people who are very fluent in English. I hope I made myself understood somehow.
Very, very, very clear. Thank you. And so grateful that you brought me back to that very first slide. I put that in because I know sometimes people expect me to just talk about brains, and I like to keep my customers happy. So I did mention that to begin with, but I forgot to come back to it. It's really interesting that you've made that point, because in fact, the case we made is that in Dutch and English, there are many homographs. So let's take ROOM. I'm sorry, maybe you know some Dutch, but ROOM in Dutch means cream. So if you're fluent, and all of our participants were extremely fluent, as most Dutch people are, Dutch English speaker, you're used to seeing words printed in English that actually have a totally different meaning in Dutch. And there's several examples of those in Dutch and English. The reason is that Frisian, as you probably all know, is really the closest language to English. So Dutch, Frisian, English, they're quite closely related. And of course, the alphabet is the same. So just by chance, you're going to get words that are spelled in one way that are meaning something else in the languages. So the idea we had is that, and actually this is based on work done by some colleagues, psycholinguists, Walter van Herven in Netherlands, that they're called formally interlingual homographs. And so there's quite a literature on the effect of those for bilingual speakers on word recognition. I don't know Portuguese well enough to be able to comment if that's possibly true between English and Portuguese, but I would agree with you that most certainly it's the mappings between orthography and phonology that are consistent or inconsistent that matters. And in the case of bilingual monoscriptals, Dutch English, when those are not consistent, then you get the effects.
That sounds fascinating, because apparently if there is, what I would guess, and that's just, it's pretty much a wild guess at this stage, but apparently if the scripts are, different enough, that seems to be actually facilitating, because probably the representations are being developed separately. That's kind of a guess at this stage, but that's pretty interesting.
Well, there's quite a theoretical debate in the field on biscriptal reading on this topic, and the jury's still out. I kind of mentioned it also at the beginning, because the language dependent and the language independent dichotomy is still very much debated, not just in the neuroscience, but in the psycholinguistic field too. And the idea, even David Green, who's a friend of mine, I see him regularly, we go for a walk, on Hampstead Heath. He's still very unclear about whether you need to assume, different schema for two languages that are quite different. So Chinese and English are radically different in every dimension. Dutch and English are the extreme opposite, the most similar. So whether you need to assume a unitary neural account to inhibit two different schema, or whether you need to simply look at a single schema but different sort of contention scheduling mechanisms. It's a debate that's ongoing.
I would say that the fact that the debate is still ongoing is very positive, especially because your talk makes it very clear that now those studies are being made with more diversity of languages and language typologies, right? So a lot of the debate about whether language dependent or independent representations were going on, especially considering work done up to the 80s, it was very restricted in terms of the language typologies involved, right? So now that people are actually discussing languages which were not so commonly put on the table for investigation, I think that this is very positive. And
could I make a kind of disruptive comment that might be difficult to swallow? But actually, the translanguaging community, as you know well, philosophically does not want to consider differences in writing systems at all. So naming a language, naming a writing system is anathema to colleagues who are working in translanguaging. So although, yes, the history of psycholinguistics, and that's just my expertise, and certainly neurolinguistics, is dominated by the codification of writing or speech. And therefore the definition of a bilingual as L1 plus L2, etc. I mean, that whole tradition is completely rejected by Li Wei and Angel Lin, and I don't know Ophelia, but you understand what I'm saying. So I'm questioning now the utility of even considering the typology that I was fascinated throughout my whole career. And of course, I chose Chinese because it's, as I mentioned, it's literally the most different language to English on the planet. We have a lot of questions coming up, so I don't want to dominate the time. How much time do we have?
Lillian, can you help us out with that?
15 minutes or so, a bit more. It's okay.
So do you want me to read out do you want to keep moderating, Ricardo, or should I just, because I can see the questions here.
Questions? Okay, so yeah, I think I'll pass it over to you then, and maybe if there is something coming through different media, I'll just pay attention to that, right, Lillian? If you need to.
Oh, they are, Ricardo. They are all in the chat here. They were copied from YouTube here into the chat.
Okay, all right.
Find them here in Zoom in the chat.
I think the best way to go about it is to let Professor Weeks select questions that might be.
Yeah, maybe he can choose those that he would like to start with.
Ricardo, please chip in if you have some other comments. I'll be very happy to hear them. I'm very interested in your perspective and feedback. Thank you for your questions so far. So it's just my experience hosting a similar meeting recently. If we don't give time to the chat, then it's the problem. We're going to run out.
We can forward there later on. Yeah.
Okay, so the first question comes from Meravoni, which is very useful to me because I don't know that reference, but I'm very grateful to receive it. And also this work you're doing is very much exactly in my current interest. You ask, what is the methodology used in translanguaging research? I think the best type of methodology here is, and you point out that most work is ethnographic and looking at language policies, and I'm very familiar with that. A lot of it came out of Hong Kong, actually, the university that I was working at. I would say that there is no one best methodology here. My experience with ethnographic research is that it's very informative for generating hypotheses, but I'm a natural experimentalist. So I tend to always look for some theoretical perspective. I also believe that it's important to consider what possible experimental methodology we could apply to these questions. And I would not exclude brain imaging, but brain imaging doesn't capture well these philosophical issues that we're considering, such as the construction of meaning. I don't know any research in the neurobiology of language that does a good job at that. So in order to do that, we need, proper linguistic analysis. I think, to answer your question very specifically, I think a rigorous linguistic approach is necessary because although we may reject typology, we may reject the, if you like, the universalist approach, the whole Chomskyan dogma in our work, then we still need to know the concepts and constructs that we are referring to in order to move forward. So in the case of writing systems, I've mentioned the types of writing systems that I find interesting, but I think it's necessary to know what those are in order to make sense of and generate hypotheses that could be tested experimentally. And I think it's also important to think about a conceptual framework that is embracing the diversity of writing systems, but also considering precisely what Ricardo mentioned. And I didn't talk about it today, but that's a whole other lecture on the transparency in alphabets between orthography and phonology. We've actually transposed that to Chinese, again, a whole other lecture. But I think critically, what's important is to adopt a sociolinguistic approach that embraces ethnography, of course, but often it doesn't. Some sociologists do have interest in linguistics, and that's great. But I think a rigorous, conceptually grounded approach, which is traditional linguistics, is necessary. So that's my answer to that question. Okay, now I'm getting a lot of, my chat window is not big enough, so let me just see. The next question comes from Tatiana. Juliana Gregg is asking how many languages I speak and what I think is the most important thing to be able to be a good teacher of other languages. I think embracing the languages of the students, that's my experience. So having taught in Hong Kong, Cantonese is dominant, but Mandarin is also something that's used. I mean, we played lots of games in class. I taught students neuroanatomy. I mean, that doesn't get any more difficult for a non-native English speaker. So they had to learn Greek, Latin, all sorts of terms. So I just made it playful and respecting the other language. So I'd often ask students to come and write in Cantonese or characters, you know, something like, you know, lateral geniculate nucleus. And of course, they were horrified because you can't translate lateral geniculate nucleus into characters, and it's just not possible. So I think respecting other languages, but also understanding that if you have to teach expert words to neuroscientists, which you do, then you have to choose a particular genre, a particular code to do it. So that's my answer. Thank you for your question.
Can I ask one question, please?
Yes.
And it's, in fact, I'm picking it up here from YouTube. Rafael Zacaron is saying, he says that translanguaging is very, transliteracy, it's fascinating, especially in primary schools and places where you have children from different backgrounds. But then he raises a question that was something that I was thinking here too, and a colleague of mine, we were talking about this here in the chat. How about the use of this? How will the universities and the academic world embrace transliteracy at some level? When will it happen? Because, for instance, we as Brazilians, when we intend to publish, if the editors notice that we are not native speakers, we have to go through an editing process with our texts. So this is, you know, it's really required this standard English. I think that this is what Rafael also means, that it's not acceptable exactly in all different levels. And the second question is a concern, is not a question, it's more a comment in terms of pragmatics, because, okay, you can go with you can transliterate, translanguage from one language to the other, or mixing the languages that you know, but still you should be aware of the use, the pragmatic use, you know, what you can say, the way you can say, or you can write in your culture. Because when we talk about language, we are also talking about culture. It's always associated. So we should have also this awareness of how to transit from one language to the other, or mixing them without breaking rules, pragmatic rules. I mean, just
yes, let me answer the question directly. The answer is it already is happening in universities. So I don't myself teach English as a second language, but colleagues at King's, just up the street, do. And they, in fact, it was even before the pandemic, we were debating whether to let students who are in China doing, I mean, honestly speaking, most courses in the UK were already online courses or done so that in flexible learning. So you could get a degree from Cambridge, but you were living in Greenland. So the Chinese students, of which there are many in London, they were literally writing their essay and Google translating into English. And this was actually seen as a great idea by my colleagues at King's. This was going to be really a good way of increasing the revenue for King's College. And then the pandemic struck, and then suddenly everyone had to do it. Now, writing, as you say, as a second language is not something I have any expertise on at all. And by the way, I don't read and write Chinese well, so that's something to say. But the key point is that as we progress, the quality of the literal verbatim translation is becoming almost perfect. But in the process, we're missing an awful lot of nuance. And of course, you can pay to have somebody edit your final paper. The University of Hong Kong actually employs somebody to do that for non-native English speakers to publish work. In the case of homographs, you see the problem. In the case of instant messaging, there's an even greater problem because you don't have an editor, you don't have somebody who can quickly flip, you're just relying on the algorithm. So I can give you an example, and I'm sorry, I'm going to spill into geopolitics. So as you know, China and Australia have a very fractious relationship now. I'm from Sydney, I'm born in Sydney. But the interesting example I want to give you is where the UBS, a Swiss bank in Hong Kong, published a piece referring to the value of Chinese pigs in the pork belly market. That is, you know, what is the futures price of pork from China due to many things, floods and other things. There's a pork shortage. Anyway, this was translated verbatim into a phrase which essentially meant that he was referring to Chinese people as pigs. So because in English we can describe an animal as an ethnicity, Chinese pig, because of where it resides, that concept, that nuance, is not appreciated by the instant messaging translation of the algorithm, and probably never will be. So the consequence was that the share price of UBS dropped by 10% overnight. I've got numerous examples of other miscommunications between the Australian and Chinese government, but let me just give you one example from my own mother, which I think you will resonate with all of you. You know, when she was texting her old friend in Michigan, he sent back something with the word resent in the message. resent. What he was saying is that he had resent the text because it was deleted or something. What she thought he said was he resented her for something she had said previously. You see? So the consequences of misunderstanding are huge, especially when you consider that not only in English, but in Chinese, you have multiple ways of reading the same symbol, multiple meanings. And the example that Ricardo gave about Dutch and English is a perfect example. So, you know, it's not the case that using this transliterating practice in universities is faultless, but it's absolutely accelerating at a very dramatic pace. Okay, so next question. Yes, and thank you for pointing this out. And this is something we discovered in my recent conference, that you can transliterate in YouTube. You obviously know that, I guess. So the subtitles you can produce in YouTube are almost instant, but you can do it in Zoom as well. So you can actually transliterate, you could copy paste your text into Google Translate and then resend as a text in Zoom. But Teresa, who's not with us unfortunately, but my current postdoc working and living in Hong Kong is Teresa Carteri Goulart, and she's from Sao Paulo. She discovered that you can use Zoom you can transliterate on Zoom. Okay, so don't ask me how you do it, but it is possible. So you can put your thoughts into your language in Portuguese and it will be presented to me as an English question. So that's one comment, thank you. And since I mentioned the concept of transparency of languages, would you consider that transliterating differs for more opaque languages to more transparent ones? Well, I think that the real question is not, it's about the feature of the language itself. So and here we need a rigorous linguistic analysis. So in the case of English words, you know, there are hundreds of thousands, and they can be written in a very simple code that we call an alphabet. But sometimes there are similar sounding words that are very similarly spelled but have different meanings. In Chinese, that's really a huge problem because in Chinese, there's only 400 syllables in the whole language. Just 400 syllables. Now, as linguists in the audience, just take that in for a moment. A language with only 400 syllables. But the productivity of Chinese comes from tone. In Cantonese, there's 9. In Mandarin, there's 4. So the same syllable can have 50 different meanings in Chinese languages. Now that makes spoken communication quite difficult and tone critical. Tone is not rendered in text. Almost never. So a character does not have a signal that says, oh, use the 4th tone when you pronounce my syllable. You just have to know it. You have to remember it. It's memory, sheer verbatim memory. And that's what I would call an opaque script. Of interest is that a hypothesis I had years ago, which is in print in Annals of Dyslexia, is that children with dyslexia in Chinese can actually bootstrap on this similarity across the spoken language, because each character for 50 different, so let me give you a very concrete example. The syllable zhu in Chinese means pig if it's pronounced zhu. If it's pronounced zhu, it means something completely different. But the way to distinguish zhu and zhu is through written characters, because the written character for the 2 syllables is entirely different, completely different. So a child with dyslexia who has phonological problems in Chinese can actually use literacy to bootstrap their vocabulary. If they don't know the difference between zhu and zhu, which is often a problem for children, as you know, who have speech difficulties, they can use characters to teach themselves the difference between those 2 sounds. So there's a cultural and linguistic difference that can only be understood through cross-linguistic knowledge and analysis.
Okay, I think that you are okay with the questions. Yeah, we have very much ahead of our time. Yeah, now we're taking a lot of time. We don't want to take a Professor Rick for so long.
Well, I'm happy to keep talking. I'm happy to keep talking if you have the time.
Okay.
So right ahead.
I don't know, Ricardo, is there any other question that you would like to raise that was done by the audience, or?
I think there is Juliana's remark. She made the remark, actually, transliterating, which is a very interesting. The translating machine, it's about the translate machine, right? So if Juliana is present, she could help me out, but I understand that what she wants to ask is whether a translate machine captures every type of nuance in meaning, especially considering the languages change a lot over time. So, conceptions. So it's if I understand Juliana's question, it is very much about the efficacy of the translate machine.
Okay, I missed Juliana's question, but I get the gist of it. The answer is no. So here's where the issue of deep learning and the embrace of algorithms is problematic, because machine translation attempted to do just that, attempted to look at the grammatical differences, try to come up with a phonological rendition, and to give an in-context translation in print. And of course, humans do that too. So professional linguists who translate between Chinese and English, of which in Hong Kong, there are, of course, many hundreds of thousands, are necessary, because deep learning is only as good as the data it uses. The data that it uses, I'm just going to focus on Chinese and English here, is driven entirely by what is published online. Now, it happens that in colonial locations like Hong Kong and others I could mention, bilingual transliteration, including India, has been going on for 2 centuries. So in Hong Kong, all of the legal decisions ever made for nearly 200 years are based on English common law, which means that every decision ever made is published in English text or print, and Chinese print, because it's an officially biscriptal culture. So that means if you put all of that data online with the perfectly translated or nearly perfectly translated Chinese character to English and vice versa, and then make it available to an algorithm, the algorithm will learn from, terabytes of previously translated data how to do that, so how to come up with a solution that gives you the correct translation with no mind at all. This is simply mathematics. And the more data you put in, the better it becomes. It converges on the solution. But without the initial translation, you're sunk, right? So garbage in, garbage out. It will never be possible using that method to develop a linguistically sophisticated algorithm, in my opinion, until you are able to solve this difficulty of context. And algorithms are not context sensitive, and they're definitely not skilled in semiotics, that's for sure. So, if you're willing to tolerate verbatim translation for purposes such as commerce, education, ideology, and let's face it, the same thing's been happening for centuries, translating the Bible, translating the Quran into different writing system. It's been going on for a very long time. This is nothing new with deep learning. It's just that you could be lured into believing that the solution is perfect, and actually it never, well, I shouldn't say never, but it seems unlikely that it ever will be. Does that answer your question? I kind of lost what the question was because I couldn't read it.
I think the question was answered all right. I think, from what I understood from the question, yes, I think your answer is brilliant. Thank you very much. May I add a very quick comment? One of the things that I really appreciated about your talk, Professor Weeks, is the way you expand beyond, linguistic codification and the linguistics of that. Because just now in your answer to Juliana, I think it's very clear that there is a lot intertwined, like, issues of context, issues of the social dimension of language use. And when you bring the social linguistics, I think, this is really very important. And the example you gave about the situation of pig and pork and how that was translated in business between Australia and China, in a sense, that made me think about ideological scenarios that we have now in Brazil, and how actually literacy beyond just language codification is important in education and multilingual settings, because things can be kidnapped by ideological reasons, in the sense of actually establishing social hierarchies and the kind of strategy that fascists might be willing to implement. So I think that is a very interesting line of thinking if we consider our jobs as language educators and language professionals in Brazil. So thank you very much. It was, I think that was very, very, very relevant indeed. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to be in trouble with your president as well as the president of China. So please don't pass. I'd like to be able to visit Brazil again, at least. I don't want to cut myself off from the rest of the world completely.
I am fully responsible for my last remark. That's
yeah, I'm going to say no comment at this point. But,
Okay. Well, then I think we will thank you again, Professor Weeks, for this brilliant talk, these nice interactions. Thank the audience for being here with us, for their participation. And then I would now give the floor back to Leda, so that she presents the upcoming talks that we will have until November this year. Please, Leda, thank you.
Yes, okay. So I don't want to be repetitive, but I have to say that I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Dr. Brandon, and thank you for having accepted and for this. You talk in this, so it's so in you, it's so natural that I think it's the audience can really not only grasp, reflect on everything you said. And I was even telling my group here that what you say has a lot more. It's for me, it's some kind of movement really that can really change, human beings in the way people think, in the direction that understanding that we are equal, but not in the old sense of we are all equals, but in fact, we are equal in the sense that each of us is one in our diversity, we are equals, right? And this diversity really being respected, even in terms of translanguaging, transliterating. So thank you so much for adding this to my own reflection. Thank you, thank you. So, we have 3 more talks in this series. One in September by Dr. Denise Neumann. She's German, in fact. She's at the University of Auckland. And this talk is going to be very interesting, I think, because she's going to talk about this research from the Growing Up in New Zealand project. And I think this project was in fact inspired by a project in Australia, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if it has the same name in Australia, but they have been following this group of researchers. They follow the child from the womb of the mother until they are, I think children now are like 6 or 7. And all the smoking habits and everything, and then they follow them through the years. So she's going to talk about antenatal and perinatal risk factors for receptive language and executive control in preschool children. I think it's something also very relevant. And then in October, we're going to have Dr. Regine Kolinsky from University
Belgium. From Belgium.
Belgium, yes. And does literacy impact high-level cognitive functions? In November, which we're going to have the last talk, Dr. Mary Helen Imordino-Young from the University of Southern California. She hasn't given the title of her talk yet, but probably will be in the lines of this trying to connect neuroscience with education. She has this very wonderful book called We Feel, Therefore We Learn. And I think it's going to be very interesting. So you are all invited. Yes, and thank you all again. Thank you to my colleague Ricardo De Souza. Thank you, the audience here and in YouTube. Yes. All right.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to
have a
see
nice
you.
evening, Brandon.
Yeah, it's so nice to meet you all, and I appreciate your questions, and Ricardo for your inspiring moderation. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Maybe face to face at some.
Hopefully. In Florianopolis.
Hopefully.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.